So I want you to picture this. It is January 13th, 1920. You sit down, you open up your morning copy of the New York Times, and you turn over to the editorial page.
Right, the paper of record.
Exactly. And right there, in this section called Topics of the Times, the editorial board is just ruthlessly tearing apart this quiet 37-year-old physics professor from Massachusetts.
And they didn't hold back.
Oh, not at all. The piece is literally titled, "A Severe Strain on Credulity." They're openly calling this guy a fraud. They're stating with this absolute unearned authority that he lacks the basic knowledge ladled out daily in high schools.
Yeah, the mockery was just incredibly pointed. I mean, the Times essentially declared to the entire nation that this professor was either a charlatan or, just a complete idiot. And why? Simply because he had proposed that a rocket could provide thrust in the vacuum of space.
Which is just wild in hindsight.
It really is. The editorial board proudly and completely incorrectly asserted that a rocket needs atmospheric air to push against in order to fly. They claimed that to say otherwise was violating the fundamental laws of dynamics.
Which is just a breathtaking misunderstanding of Newton's third law of motion. I mean, basic physics.
Right, but because it was the New York Times saying it, that public humiliation just became the accepted truth.
People laughed at him. He literally became a national punchline overnight.
And he had to live with that ridicule for decades, right alongside a scientific establishment that largely viewed his work as, comic book fantasy.
But history is a funny way of balancing the scales, right? Even if it takes, almost half a century.
49 years to be exact.
Right. So flash forward 49 years, July 17th, 1969.
A very specific day.
The exact day after the Apollo 11 astronauts launched on a giant column of fire to go walk on the lunar surface, the New York Times prints this tiny 3-paragraph correction buried away on page 43.
Better late than never, I guess.
Barely. They admitted that, actually, yes, a rocket can function in a vacuum. The paper formally stated, and I quote, "The Times regrets the error."
A 50-year delay on a correction. Vindication for the exact physics they had spent a whole generation just laughing at.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are looking into the life of Robert H. Goddard, the man who quite literally dragged humanity into the space age.
You might recognize the name from the Goddard Space Flight Center.
The Goddard crater on the moon.
Exactly.
Huh.
But the actual human story behind that name is vastly more intense and tragic and, frankly, just astonishing than any textbook summary is going to give you.
We're talking about a life defined by chronic illness, a level of obsessive secrecy that bordered on actual paranoia, continuous public humiliation, and, of course, unparalleled mechanical genius.
Right, because Goddard didn't just sit around theorizing about space travel. He took the theoretical math, walked into the physics lab, proved it, and then went out into freezing snow to actually build and fly the hardware.
And our mission today is to dig into exactly how he managed to do that. How does a sickly kid in Massachusetts end up building the world's first liquid-fueled rocket?
And why did his own country's military and academic institutions completely turn their backs on him?
And maybe the darkest twist of all, how did his highly classified, secretive blueprints end up becoming the foundation for the most terrifying weapons of World War II?
Before eventually becoming the vehicles that took us to the stars.
It's a huge story. So let's start at the beginning. Because to understand that relentless drive, the sheer stubbornness required just endure decades of being laughed at while working in total isolation, you really have to look at his youth.
Yeah, the shadow that hung over his early years is critical. So Robert Hutchings Goddard was born in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1882. And he did not have, a normal, carefree childhood.
No, his early life was entirely defined by the constant looming threat of his own mortality.
He was an incredibly frail boy. We're talking severe stomach problems, recurring bouts of pleurisy, endless colds, bronchitis.
Just constantly sick.
Constantly. His physical health was so delicate that he missed massive blocks of school. He actually fell 2 full years behind his classmates.
Wow. 2 years.
Yeah. And he was an only child, but only because his younger brother had died before turning 1. So there's already this heavy atmosphere in the house. Plus, when Robert was 16, his mother contracted tuberculosis.
Oh, man. In the late 1800s, that's practically a death sentence.
It was terrifying. The family actually had to move from Boston back to Worcester just to find clearer air for her lungs. So death and severe illness were simply part of his everyday reality.
But that confinement kind of had a secondary effect, didn't it? Because he was so often bedridden or kept indoors to protect his lungs, he had to find something to do.
Right. He turned to reading. He just devoured the physical sciences section of the local public library.
I love that his dad encouraged it too. His father was a manufacturer and an inventor, and he actively fed this curiosity. He bought him a telescope, a microscope, and a subscription to Scientific American.
Which is like throwing gasoline on a fire for a kid like this. You can see the tinkering starts so early. In the late 1880s, American cities were really just starting to get electrified. And young Robert became completely obsessed with the invisible power of electricity.
His dad showed him how to generate a static charge, right? Like scuffing his feet on the family carpet.
Yes, and Robert immediately tries to weaponize this into a new technology.
As you do when you're 5.
Exactly. So, as a 5-year-old, he grabs a piece of battery zinc, goes out to the gravel walkway, and furiously starts scuffing his feet. He was genuinely convinced that if he could store enough static charge in the zinc, it would alter his gravity.
Wait, he thought static electricity would let him jump higher.
That was the theory. He thought he could counteract gravity.
Spoiler alert for the listeners, he couldn't jump any higher.
No, physics doesn't quite work that way.
Yeah.
But his mother's reaction is what's really telling here. She warned him to stop the experiments, telling him that if he actually succeeded in altering his gravity, he could go sailing away and might not be able to come back.
That is such a poetic warning, especially for a boy who would literally grow up to invent the mechanics of leaving the Earth entirely.
It really is.
Yeah.
And he just kept pushing those boundaries as he got older. There's this one story of him mixing chemicals and accidentally blowing up a section of the house in this giant cloud of smoke.
A rite of passage for every great chemist.
True. But by age 16, his fascination with flight pushed him way beyond simple kites. He actually attempted to construct a balloon out of solid aluminum.
Okay, we need to talk about the aluminum balloon, because it's such a fascinating insight into his young, developing mind.
It makes logical sense to a 16-year-old, right? Aluminum is incredibly light compared to steel or iron.
Right.
So he spent 5 weeks methodically shaping the raw metal in his home workshop. He's trying to create this rigid structure that he could fill with hydrogen gas.
But the physics of an aluminum balloon just do not work out.
They absolutely do not. And it comes down to the square cube law and the density of the material.
Can you break that down for us? Like, why can't I make a balloon out of metal?
Okay, so to displace enough atmospheric air to generate the buoyancy needed to lift the balloon, the volume of the balloon has to be enormous. You need a ton of hydrogen inside.
Right, simple buoyancy.
But making an aluminum shell large enough to hold that volume of hydrogen requires so much metal that the sheer weight of the shell itself cancels out the lifting force of the hydrogen.
Ah, so the bigger you make it, the heavier the shell gets.
Exactly. To stop the metal from just collapsing under its own weight, you have to make it thicker. But the material thickness makes it far too heavy to fly. The math just fights you at every turn.
And he figures this out the hard way. The balloon fails completely. But what I love is that instead of throwing a tantrum, he meticulously documents the failure.
Yes, his lab notes are amazing.
He writes in his notebook, "Balloon will not go up. Aluminum is too heavy. Failure crowns enterprise." And he actually misspelled failure, which is endearing. But you can already see the scientific method taking root in his brain.
He doesn't view the failed balloon as a personal defeat. He views it as a necessary data point, which is a mindset that will save him later in life.
But that analytical mindset, it kind of lacked a specific direction, right? Until October 19th, 1899.
The defining turning point of his entire life.
So, Goddard is 17 years old. He has just finished reading H.G. Wells's newly published science fiction novel, The War of the Worlds.
The famous story of Martians invading Earth.
Exactly. And on that specific afternoon in late October, he takes a saw and climbs up a tall cherry tree in the back of his barn to trim some dead branches.
He looks out toward the fields in the east. And the way he later described this moment in his diaries is, it's almost spiritual.
It really is.
He said he imagined how wonderful it would be to make some device which had even the possibility of ascending to Mars, and how it would look on a small scale if sent up from the meadow right at his feet.
And he doesn't just daydream. Even up in the tree, he immediately starts trying to solve the physics of propulsion.
Right. He wrote that he imagined a weight whirling around a horizontal shaft, moving faster above the shaft than below it, to furnish lift via centrifugal force.
Now, from a modern physics standpoint, that wouldn't actually produce a directional thrust in a vacuum, right?
No, it wouldn't. It's essentially a reactionless drive, which defies momentum conservation. But the specific mechanical solution doesn't matter here. What matters is the psychological shift.
He wrote, "I was a different boy when I descended the tree from when I ascended. Existence at last seemed very purposive."
I love that quote. He climbs the tree as a sickly teenager trimming dead wood, and he climbs down as a young man who has decided he is going to engineer a path to another planet.
And he took this so seriously. For the rest of his life, he treated October 19th as a deeply private holiday. He called it Anniversary Day and marked it in his diary every single year.
But that newfound purpose was constantly under threat from his own biology, because his body just kept failing him.
Let's fast forward to early 1913. Goddard is in his early 30s. He has fought through all these illnesses to become his high school valedictorian, earn degrees from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and complete his PhD in physics at Clark University.
He's brilliant.
Unbelievably brilliant. He has just accepted a prestigious research fellowship at Princeton University. And then
His body completely gives out. He suffers a massive physical collapse. The diagnosis is tuberculosis.
And in 1913, before modern antibiotics, a severe tuberculosis diagnosis was terrifying.
Very often a slow, agonizing death sentence. He's forced to resign his fellowship at Princeton. He travels back to Worcester, and his doctors essentially tell him to put his affairs in order. They did not expect him to survive.
They send him home to lie in bed and bluntly wait to die.
But instead of surrendering to the disease, he channels all of his terror into his mathematics. The doctors told him to rest, to sit outside in the fresh air and avoid any exertion.
But Goddard was consumed by this existential panic.
Exactly. He was terrified that he was going to die before he could get the complex calculus for spaceflight out of his brain and onto paper. He felt this desperate obligation to leave the blueprints behind for humanity.
I want you to try to put yourself in that bedroom in Worcester for a second. Imagine being 31 years old. You have this massive world-changing vision in your head, but your lungs are literally dissolving. You are coughing up blood. The doctors say it's over.
It's a grim picture.
And your response is to bargain with your own failing body. He forces himself to sit up in bed for exactly 1 hour a day to draft the foundational math for human space travel.
It's like a science fiction Beethoven desperately composing his final symphony while he goes deaf.
That's the perfect analogy. The obsession to solve the math was the only thing keeping his heart beating.
And it drove him into intense conflict with his own caregivers. The nurses attending to him would find his mathematical notes hidden under his mattress or stuffed in his bedsheets.
They were trying to help him.
They were. They tried to confiscate the papers to force him to sleep and recover. But Goddard fought them, flatly telling the nurses, "I have to live to do this work."
That brush with death has to completely rewire a person's psychology, right? Like, you don't walk away from that the same person.
It permanently altered how he interacted with the world. When you deeply internalize the fact that your time is strictly limited, that any given hour of work might literally be your last, you develop a ferocious sense of urgency.
You stop caring about what other people think.
Precisely. You stop caring about social conventions or academic debates. You just do the work.
And that urgency really explains the frantic pace of his early output. Against all odds, he actually survives the tuberculosis. But the clock is ticking loudly in his head now. So before World War I even breaks out, he starts producing this avalanche of groundbreaking physics.
Yeah, by 1912, he had already begun tackling the core mathematical problem of rocketry. He independently derived the rocket equation.
Now, to be fair to the global timeline, a Russian scientist named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky had published this basic equation a decade earlier.
True. Tsiolkovsky is a monumental figure in theoretical astronautics. But his work was almost entirely theoretical and highly idealized. He calculated the velocity of a rocket in empty space without considering the environment of Earth.
He kind of ignored the hard part.
Right, he ignored gravity and atmosphere. Goddard went significantly further. He applied heavy calculus to factor in the crushing realities of Earth's gravity and atmospheric aerodynamic drag during a vertical ascent.
So what did that math actually prove?
He essentially proved, through rigorous math, that you could build a vehicle that started with a surprisingly small initial mass, as long as two conditions were met.
Okay, what are they?
First, the exhaust gases had to be ejected from the rocket at an incredibly high velocity. And second, the vast majority of the rocket's total weight had to be the propellant itself.
Which is exactly how modern rockets are built. They are basically flying fuel tanks.
Exactly. But Goddard wasn't satisfied with just the math. He was an experimentalist at heart. He knew that the broader scientific community, the very people who would eventually mock him in the Times, believed that rockets relied on the ambient atmosphere to generate thrust.
Right, they thought the exhaust gas is essentially pushed off the air behind the rocket, like a swimmer kicking off a pool wall.
Which means they assumed that once a rocket got up into the vacuum of space where there is no air, the engine would just spin its wheels, so to speak. It would have nothing to push against, so it would generate no thrust.
To definitively disprove this, Goddard designed and built these elaborate experiments in the physics lab at Clark University. He placed small, solid propellant rockets inside a sealed tube and literally pumped out almost all the air to create a vacuum environment simulating deep space.
It was a brilliant experimental setup.
And he measured the thrust generated by the rocket firing inside the vacuum compared to firing it in a normal room. And the results were completely counterintuitive to the establishment.
Right. Not only did the rocket work in a vacuum, but the thrust actually increased by roughly 20%.
Which is crazy, but I'm glad you brought that up, because we really need to explain the why here. Why does taking away the air make the engine 20% stronger? Make it make sense.
Okay, it comes down to ambient pressure. Think about what a rocket engine is doing. It is creating a massive, high-pressure explosion inside a combustion chamber, and it's trying to force those expanding gases out through a narrow nozzle at the bottom.
Right.
The faster those gases exit the nozzle, the harder the rocket is pushed in the opposite direction. Newton's third law. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Sure, basic physics.
Now, if you fire that rocket at sea level, the engine has to fight against the Earth's atmosphere. The ambient air pressure is roughly 14.7 pounds per square inch. That air is literally shoving its way back up into the rocket nozzle, resisting the exhaust gases trying to get out.
So the engine has to spend a significant amount of its energy just pushing the Earth's atmosphere out of the way. It's choked.
Precisely. The exhaust is choked by back pressure. But when Goddard fired his rocket in a vacuum tube, there was no air pressure pushing back against the nozzle.
Because the tube is empty.
Right. The exhaust gases were completely unopposed. They could expand infinitely and freely, exiting the nozzle at a significantly higher velocity. Higher exhaust velocity directly equals higher thrust. The vacuum didn't hinder the rocket, it unleashed it.
And Goddard, who was raised in the manufacturing hub of Worcester, knows that proving something in a lab isn't enough. You have to lock down the intellectual property.
Oh, absolutely. He was very protective of his ideas.
In 1914, freshly recovered from his near-death bout with TB, he files 2 foundational U.S. patents.
Patent number 11,102,653 for a multi-stage rocket, and patent number 11,103,503 for a rocket fueled by either solid explosives or liquid propellants, specifically citing gasoline and liquid nitrous oxide.
Those 2 documents are basically the Magna Carta of the space age. They established the legal framework for almost all modern aerospace propulsion. Every multi-stage rocket today owes a nod to that 1914 patent.
But having the patents and having the funding to actually build the things are 2 completely different realities. And this brings us to an incredible historical curveball.
Yeah, this part always gets me. Goddard is so often portrayed as the secretive lone wolf who hated working with the establishment. But when World War I breaks out, he does the exact opposite.
He does. He actively tries to hand his revolutionary technology directly to the United States military.
Right. It's 1917. The U.S. is entering the bloody conflict in Europe. Universities across the country are pivoting their research to the war effort. Goddard firmly believes that his highly efficient, solid-fuel rocket propulsion can be adapted for the battlefield.
He thinks he can build mobile, lightweight artillery, long-range field weapons, and even naval torpedoes. He actively pitches both the Army and the Navy.
The Navy reviews his proposals and essentially ignores them.
No.
But the Army Ordnance Department is intrigued enough to let him work. Goddard teams up with a brilliant coworker named Clarence N. Hickman. Together, they designed something entirely new for infantry combat: a tube-fired, recoil-free rocket launcher.
And we really need to talk about why recoil-free is such a huge deal for the military. Normally, if an infantryman fires a heavy artillery shell, the kickback, the recoil, is massive. It will break your shoulder or tear the mounting right off a vehicle.
But a rocket doesn't work like a bullet in a gun barrel.
No, a gun relies on a contained explosion pushing against a closed breech to force a bullet out the front. That closed breech absorbs the massive backward force.
Right, which hits the shooter.
Exactly. But a rocket launcher is an open tube. The rocket propels itself. The exhaust just blows out the back of the open tube, meaning there is virtually no backward kick against the person holding the launcher.
So Goddard and Hickman build this prototype, And in November 1918, Goddard travels down to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland to demonstrate it for the U.S. Army Signal Corps.
And the image of this test is just wonderful.
It's so makeshift. He sets up the launcher using two standard music stands as a firing platform, just to prove how lightweight and recoil-free it is. He fires the rockets, and the Army officers are completely blown away.
They immediately see the tactical value of a lightweight weapon that a single soldier can carry to destroy fortified positions. It was an undeniable success. He proved the viability of infantry rocket weapons on November 6, 1918.
And then the timing of history just completely ruins him. 5 days later, November 11th, 1918. The Compiègne Armistice is signed in a railway carriage in France. World War I is over.
Just like that, the fighting stops and the military budgets instantly dry up. The Army suddenly has no immediate need for a revolutionary infantry weapon. They thank Goddard for his time, discontinue the development entirely, and shove the blueprints into a filing cabinet.
Think about the profound what-if of that timing. If World War I had dragged on for another 6 months, Goddard's weapon would almost certainly have gone into mass production.
He would have emerged from the war as a highly funded, celebrated military contractor with an entire laboratory at his disposal.
Instead, the war ends, the military abandons him, and he gets shoved right back into the life of an isolated physics professor, begging for pennies to fund his research.
It is a devastating pivot. And there's a fascinating postscript to that specific weapon. It sat in an Army drawer for over 2 decades.
Wait, really?
Yes. During World War II, as American soldiers found themselves facing heavily armored German tanks, the Army suddenly remembered Goddard's recoil-free tube. His old co-worker, Clarence Hickman, along with other ordnance officers, pulled the design out, attached a shape-charged explosive to the front of the rocket, and mass-produced it.
No way.
Yes, it became the famous M1 bazooka.
That is wild. The bazooka was basically a repurposed Goddard space tech prototype from 1918.
Exactly. But for Goddard in 1919, that military door was firmly closed.
Yeah.
He still needed money. So he started sending detailed proposals to the National Geographic Society, the Aero Club of America, and the Smithsonian Institution.
In his proposal to the Smithsonian, he boldly claimed that he could build a rocket capable of lifting a 1-pound payload to a vertical height of 232 miles.
That is well beyond the 80 to 100-mile mark, where the Earth's atmosphere effectively ends. He was explicitly pitching a vehicle capable of reaching space.
The Smithsonian was actually impressed. In January 1917, they had agreed to give him a grant of $5,000 over 5 years.
Which wasn't life-changing money, but combined with the lab space provided by Clark University, it kept the lights on.
But that Smithsonian grant came with a catch that would inadvertently ruin his public life. By 1919, his department head at Clark University, Arthur G. Webster, grew extremely impatient with Goddard's secrecy.
Webster essentially cornered Goddard and told him, "You need to publish your data or I am going to publish it for you."
Under immense pressure, Goddard took a manuscript he had been writing and asked the Smithsonian to publish it as a formal report.
That report, published in late 1919, was titled A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. It is a 69-page, incredibly dense, math-heavy thesis.
And the actual engineering leaps described in those 69 pages are just staggering.
The most critical leap was his adaptation of the de Laval nozzle.
Right. Gustaf de Laval was a Swedish engineer who invented a specific type of nozzle for steam turbines in the late 1800s. Goddard looked at that steam nozzle and realized it was the exact key needed to make solid fuel rockets exponentially more powerful.
But you really have to explain how this works because the physics of it are incredibly counterintuitive.
They really are. Okay, so the de Laval nozzle has a very specific shape. It is a tube that narrows down to a tight pinch point called the throat and then widens back out into a bell shape. We call it a converging-diverging nozzle.
Right, and Goddard attached this nozzle to the bottom of a steel combustion chamber filled with burning solid propellant.
So the gas is burning inside the chamber, creating immense pressure. It wants to escape.
Yeah.
It travels down into the converging part of the nozzle where the pipe is getting narrower and narrower. What happens there?
Basic fluid dynamics kicks in. If you have a fluid or a gas moving through a pipe and you suddenly narrow that pipe, the fluid has to speed up to get the same amount of mass through the smaller opening.
Think of putting your thumb over the end of a garden hose. The water speeds up and shoots out faster.
Exactly. So as the hot exhaust gases get squeezed into the narrow throat of the nozzle, they accelerate.
That makes perfect sense. But here is the bizarre part. Once the gas hits that tight throat, it reaches the speed of sound, Mach 1. And then the pipe widens back out, the diverging part of the nozzle. Why doesn't the gas slow down when the pipe gets wider?
Right, because you take your thumb off the garden hose, the water slows down.
Exactly. So why does the gas get faster?
That is the genius of the de Laval design. Supersonic gas behaves completely differently than subsonic water in a garden hose. Once the gas crosses the threshold of the speed of sound at the throat, its physical properties change. It becomes highly compressible.
Okay, so it acts totally different.
Completely different. In the widening, diverging section of the bell, the supersonic gas rapidly expands. And as it expands, that thermal and pressure energy is violently converted into pure kinetic energy. The expanding gas pushes against the angled walls of the bell, accelerating itself even faster.
So narrowing the pipe speeds up the subsonic gas, but widening the pipe speeds up the supersonic gas.
Exactly. By applying this specific diverging geometry, Goddard captured the chaotic, wasted heat of the burning powder and focused it into a tight, incredibly fast beam of exhaust.
He took the internal efficiency of standard rockets, which at the time was a pathetic 2%, and skyrocketed it to 64%.
He was achieving exhaust velocities of over 8,000 feet per second. That is over Mach 7.
It is an engineering triumph. He has essentially solved the mechanical bottleneck of propulsion. So the Smithsonian publishes this brilliant 69-page report detailing the de Laval nozzle, the efficiency gains, and the math of extreme altitudes.
But Goddard made a fatal public relations error.
The thought experiment.
Yes. At the very end of the paper, in a highly theoretical section discussing the absolute minimum mass required to send a payload to an infinite altitude, meaning escaping Earth's gravity entirely, he included a brief thought experiment.
It's barely 8 lines of text on the second-to-last page. He casually calculated that if you built a rocket with a starting mass of about 3.2 tons, it could carry just enough Victor flash powder to reach the dark side of the moon.
Flash powder, like early photography lighting.
Right. Upon impact, the flash powder would explode, creating a brief spark of light that would be just barely visible through a powerful telescope on Earth.
It was nothing more than a theoretical proof of concept. He wasn't proposing to actually do it. He was just trying to give a relatable example of what escaping Earth's gravity meant mathematically.
But the press gets a hold of the report in January 1920. Do you think they cared about the 64% thermodynamic efficiency of the diverging nozzle? Do you think they cared about Mach 7 exhaust velocity?
Absolutely not. The media completely ignored the revolutionary physics and laser-focused on those 8 lines about the flash powder.
It was a media frenzy. On January 12th, the New York Times runs a sensational front-page headline, believes rocket can reach moon, and then the very next day, they published that brutal editorial we talked about in the intro.
And it wasn't just the Times. It became a pervasive national joke. You have to remember the context of 1920. The airplane is barely out of its infancy. World War I biplanes were essentially canvas and wood.
Right. They're incredibly primitive.
So the general public has absolutely no framework for understanding space travel. And suddenly they're being told about a local professor who wants to shoot fireworks at the moon.
It's the ultimate misrepresentation. It's like someone publishing a 70-page peer-reviewed thesis outlining the invention of a revolutionary solid-state battery that will end our reliance on fossil fuels. And on page 68, they make one passing joke about using the battery to power a flying saucer.
And the next day, every newspaper in the country calls them a lunatic who is trying to contact aliens.
Exactly. The psychological toll this took on Goddard was catastrophic. We know he was deeply sensitive to begin with, scarred by his early illness.
He was not naturally a recluse. Before this, he had written articles for magazines, he had engaged with the military, he wanted his work to be recognized.
He even tried to issue a correction to the Associated Press a week later. He sent out a statement practically begging the public to focus on the atmospheric research potential of the rockets, not the flash powder thought experiment.
But the damage was permanent. The narrative was set. He was dubbed the Moon Man.
Which is so condescending.
It really is. For years afterward, local papers would mercilessly track his test flights. If a rocket exploded or crashed, which is totally normal in aerospace testing, they would print giant mocking headlines like, "Moon rocket misses target by 238,799.5 miles."
The mockery didn't just hurt his feelings, it fundamentally broke his trust in the public and the scientific establishment. He realized that trying to explain orbital mechanics to the press was completely pointless. They were just going to twist his words to sell papers.
So, to protect his delicate ego and his already fragile health, he slammed the door shut. He built an impenetrable wall of secrecy around his laboratory. He stopped discussing his theories. He alienated himself from other scientists.
It was a defensive reflex.
Completely. But it allowed him to pivot his focus entirely away from theoretical arguments and toward physical hardware.
Which is exactly what he does. Ridiculed, isolated, but critically, still holding that Smithsonian grant money, he goes back to work. And the mockery actually pushes him to a massive technological realization.
He realizes that if he really wants to reach extreme altitudes and prove them all wrong, solid fuels like gunpowder aren't going to work.
Why not?
Solid fuels burn chaotically. Once you light them, you can't turn them off or control the thrust. He needed a fuel system that could be controlled. He needed liquid propellants.
Specifically, a bipropellant liquid system, a fuel and an oxidizer. Originally, Goddard looked at the absolute holy grail of chemical efficiency, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen.
But dealing with liquid hydrogen in the early 1920s was basically science fiction.
It was essentially impossible for a lone researcher to procure and store liquid hydrogen at that time. The cryogenics required are just too extreme.
So he made a practical compromise. He settled on liquid oxygen, often called LOX as the oxidizer, and highly refined gasoline as the fuel.
We need to pause and explain just how incredibly dangerous and difficult it is to build a machine that runs on liquid oxygen and gasoline in 1925.
Yo, it's a nightmare.
Oxygen is a gas at room temperature. To turn it into a liquid so it's dense enough to fit in a rocket tank, you have to cool it down to nearly 300 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit.
It is violently cryogenic. If liquid oxygen touches a piece of regular steel, the extreme cold makes the metal instantly brittle. If it touches organic material or oil or a spark, it can cause an instant, massive explosion.
Furthermore, because it's 300 degrees below 0, it constantly wants to boil back into a gas as it sits in the tank.
So Goddard has to figure out how to plumb this boiling, violently cold, hyperreactive liquid through thin metal tubes, mix it perfectly with highly flammable gasoline inside a metal chamber, and then light it on fire without the explosion traveling back up the tubes and detonating the entire rocket.
It is an absolute nightmare of thermodynamics and metallurgy, but by late 1925, he had actually done it?
He had built a liquid propellant engine, bolted it to a static test rack inside the physics lab at Clark University, and successfully fired it. The engine lifted its own weight against the test stand for 27 seconds.
He knows the engine works. Now he just has to make it fly. This brings us to a frozen, snowy Tuesday morning, March 16th, 1926.
A historic day.
Goddard, his wife Esther, his incredibly brave crew chief Henry Sachs, and a colleague named Percy Roop haul their equipment out to a cabbage patch on his Aunt Effie's farm in Auburn, Massachusetts.
They set up an iron launch frame in the snow, and the rocket they attached to it, which Goddard later referred to as Nell, is a mechanical oddity. It looks nothing like a modern rocket.
If you look at a photo of it, you would assume it's upside down.
You really would.
When we picture a rocket today, like a SpaceX Falcon 9 or the Apollo Saturn V, we picture a massive fuel cylinder with the fiery engine nozzle at the very bottom. Goddard's 1926 design put the combustion chamber and the nozzle at the very top of the rocket.
Right. The engine was at the top, shooting its fiery exhaust downwards. Below the engine was a long skeletal framework of thin aluminum tubes. And at the very bottom of those tubes, hanging close to the ground, were the fuel and oxygen tanks.
To protect those bottom tanks from being melted by the engine exhaust firing down on them, he installed a cone made of asbestos.
So why on earth did he design it upside down?
It was based on a flawed assumption about aerodynamics and stability, often called the pendulum fallacy.
Right, he theorized that if the thrust was pulling the rocket from the top, rather than pushing it from the bottom, the rocket would naturally self-stabilize.
Right.
He thought the heavy fuel tanks hanging below the engine would act like a pendulum on a string, automatically keeping the rocket flying straight up.
But aerodynamics don't work like a pendulum on a string when you are accelerating through a fluid like air. If the rocket starts to tilt even slightly, the airflow hits those massive tanks at the bottom, creating drag that forces the rocket to flip over. It's inherently unstable.
But he didn't know that yet. He had to fly it to find out.
So they're standing in the snow, they pressurize the tanks, and the ignition system is terrifyingly primitive.
Oh, it's basically a homemade pipe bomb.
Henry Sachs basically takes a blue torch on the end of a long stick, reaches up, and holds the flame near the top engine nozzle while Goddard pulls a cord to open the fuel valves.
They are essentially standing next to a cryogenic explosive device. Goddard pulls the cord. At first, the rocket doesn't move. There's just a deafening roar and a massive jet of flame shooting down onto the asbestos shield.
And then finally, the thrust overcomes the weight. Nell lifts off the frame.
Goddard later recorded the flight in his diary with this wonderful clinical understatement. He wrote, "Tried rocket at 2.30. It rose 41 feet and went 184 feet in 2.5 seconds after the lower half of the nozzle burned off."
It goes up 41 feet, the unstable pendulum design causes it to immediately curve over, and it crashes face first into the freezing mud of the cabbage patch. 2.5 seconds of flight.
It seems so underwhelming. 41 feet is roughly the height of a 4-story building.
Exactly. I think a lot of people hear 41 feet and think, really? That is the dawn of the space age. It sounds more like a landscaping accident than a technological revolution. How do we put this into proper historical context?
You have to view it through the same lens as the Wright brothers. On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers' first powered flight at Kitty Hawk lasted only 12 seconds and covered just 120 feet. By any modern standard, that is a pathetic flight. But the distance, it didn't matter.
Right, they proved it could be done.
What mattered was that they definitively proved that controlled, powered, heavier-than-air flight was physically possible. They broke the theoretical barrier.
Precisely. Goddard's 41-foot hop over Aunt Effie's cabbage patch broke the chemical barrier. He proved that liquid fuels and oxidizers, despite all the cryogenic freezing, the boiling off, the explosive dangers, could be successfully pumped, mixed, ignited, and provide sustained thrust to lift a vehicle against gravity.
The theoretical math of liquid propulsion was made physically real in that exact moment. Every single liquid-fueled rocket that has flown since, from the Nazi V-2 to the Saturn V that took Neil Armstrong to the moon, to the rockets launching satellites today, traces its direct, undeniable engineering lineage back to that snowy farm in Massachusetts.
It's a monumental triumph. But unfortunately for Goddard, his neighbors in Massachusetts didn't see a triumph. They just saw a crazy guy blowing up the farm.
By 1929, Goddard had scaled up his designs and launched an 11-foot rocket carrying a barometer and a camera. The rocket was incredibly loud, and when it crashed, the noise alarmed the locals. They called the police, the fire department showed up, and the newspapers pounced again.
The headlines were brutal. Things like, "Moon rocket explodes, professor terrified." The local fire marshal actually banned him from launching any more rockets in the state of Massachusetts.
The East Coast was just too heavily populated. The police were annoyed, the neighbors were angry, and the press was constantly hunting for a sensational failure.
Goddard was backed into a corner. He realized he desperately needed 3 things to survive. He needed a powerful, unassailable ally to shield his reputation. He needed a massive influx of cash to scale up his hardware. And he needed total geographic isolation.
And out of nowhere, the exact perfect ally reads one of those mocking newspaper articles, Charles Lindbergh.
In 1929, Charles Lindbergh is arguably the most famous human being on the planet. He had successfully flown solo across the Atlantic Ocean in the Spirit of St. Louis. He is a global icon of aviation.
Lindbergh was deeply interested in the distant future of flight. He understood that propellers and standard aviation fuel had physical altitude and speed limits. When he read about Goddard's loud rocket launch in the New York Times, he was instantly intrigued by the concept of jet propulsion.
But Lindbergh isn't reckless. He doesn't just drive out to Worcester. He calls up the aeronautics department at MIT and asks them point blank, is this Goddard guy a crank or is he onto something?
And the scientists at MIT assure Lindbergh that despite what the newspapers say, Goddard is a brilliant, rigorous physicist.
So Lindbergh drives up to Clark University to meet Goddard face to face. And this meeting is just fascinating on a psychological level.
You have Goddard, who has spent the entire decade building this paranoid wall of secrecy around his work, fiercely protecting it from outsiders. And then Charles Lindbergh walks into his office.
2 deeply introverted men, both burdened by the crushing weight of public fame and scrutiny, sitting down to talk about the future. Goddard immediately senses a kindred spirit. He drops the secrecy completely and shows Lindbergh everything.
Lindbergh is utterly convinced. He realizes that Goddard is holding the keys to the next century of aerospace. But Lindbergh also knows Goddard is broke. After the stock market crash of 1929, finding research funding is virtually impossible.
So Lindbergh leverages his massive celebrity influence. He secures a meeting with the immensely wealthy Guggenheim family, specifically Daniel Guggenheim and his son Harry, who were known philanthropists for aviation.
Lindbergh basically tells them, you need to fund this man or America's going to fall behind.
And the Guggenheims listen. In the spring of 1930, they agreed to provide Goddard with a massive grant of $100,000, distributed over 4 years.
Adjusted for inflation, That's well over $2 million today. It was completely game-changing.
It gives Goddard the ultimate freedom, the ability to leave. In the summer of 1930, Robert and Esther Goddard pack up their entire laboratory and move across the country to Roswell, New Mexico.
Roswell was the perfect logistical setup. The high, dry desert climate was vastly superior for Goddard's tuberculosis-scarred lungs. It offered thousands of acres of flat, open, empty land where he could launch rockets without hitting any neighbors.
And maybe most importantly, the local population in Roswell fiercely protected his privacy. It was a small ranching community, and they respected a man who wanted to be left alone.
If tourists or reporters came snooping around town asking where the rocket professor's facilities were, the locals would intentionally give them the wrong directions, sending them miles out into the empty desert.
I love that. He essentially established a 1930s high-tech startup in absolute stealth mode, supported by a small, dedicated crew of machinists operating out of a facility they called the Eden Valley Test Site. Goddard embarked on a decade of intense, isolated development.
Between 1930 and 1941, working through his A, K, L, and P series rockets, Goddard systematically solved the major mechanical bottlenecks of orbital mechanics.
Let's really dig into the engineering here, because the solutions he invented in that desert are the exact same solutions flying on modern rockets today. Let's start with stability.
Right. Remember the 1926 Cabbage patch launch? The rocket tumbled because the pendulum theory was aerodynamically flawed. Goddard quickly moved the engine to the bottom of the rocket where it belonged. But he still had a problem. How do you keep a long cylinder balancing on a pillar of fire from tipping over in the wind?
You can't just put fins on it, right? Because fins only work when the rocket is already moving incredibly fast through thick air. When the rocket is just lifting off the pad, moving slowly, fins do absolutely nothing.
Exactly. So in 1932, Goddard successfully integrates a gyroscope into the rocket's guidance system. The gyroscope senses if the rocket is starting to tip off its vertical axis. If it tips, the gyroscope triggers pneumatic valves that control small steering vanes.
And these vanes were directly in the fire, right?
Yes, these vanes were made of highly heat-resistant metal, and they sat directly inside the blistering exhaust stream at the bottom of the engine. By tilting these vanes, they physically deflected the thrust of the engine, pushing the tail of the rocket back into alignment.
It's brilliant. But he didn't stop there. Vanes inside the exhaust create drag and reduce efficiency. So he invents something even better. Gimbal steering, which we now call thrust vectoring.
Yes, gimbal steering is a monumental leap. Instead of putting little metal flaps in the fire, Goddard mounted the entire combustion chamber and nozzle on a flexible jointed gimbal. When the gyroscope sensed the rocket tilting, hydraulic actuators would physically tilt the entire engine bell.
The analogy I love for this is balancing a heavy broomstick upright on the palm of your hand. If the broomstick starts leaning to the left, you quickly shift your hand to the left, directly under the center of gravity, to push it back straight.
That is exactly what thrust vectoring does.
Mm-hmm.
The engine bell constantly shifts back and forth, pushing the bottom of the rocket to keep it perfectly balanced. It's the exact system used to steer the Space Shuttle and the Falcon 9.
Another massive hurdle he conquered in Roswell was fuel delivery. As rockets got bigger, they needed more fuel. In his early designs, Goddard used heavy tanks of highly pressurized nitrogen gas to physically force the liquid oxygen and gasoline down into the combustion chamber.
But heavy pressure tanks add dead weight. And in rocketry, weight is your absolute worst enemy. Furthermore, there's a pressure paradox.
A pressure paradox.
Yes. The combustion chamber is a contained, violent explosion. The pressure inside that chamber is immensely high. If you try to push fuel into it at a lower pressure, the explosion will literally travel backward up your fuel lines and blow up your tanks. You have to force the fuel into the chamber at a pressure significantly higher than the explosion itself.
So how do you do that without heavy pressurized gas tanks?
You invent miniature, high-speed turbopumps. Goddard designed complex, lightweight mechanical pumps that drew power directly from the rocket engine itself. These pumps spun at staggering speeds, sucking the volatile liquid oxygen and gasoline out of thin, lightweight tanks and violently ramming them into the combustion chamber at extreme pressures.
Building a pump that can handle violently cold liquid oxygen on one side while being driven by hot gases on the other side without blowing up is an incredible metallurgical feat for the 1930s.
And speaking of metallurgy, the engine melting was another massive problem. A liquid oxygen and gasoline fire burns at roughly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel Goddard was using for his combustion chambers would turn to liquid slag at around 2,500 degrees. So why didn't the rocket engines just instantly melt?
Because he invented curtain cooling. which I really want to understand the thermodynamics of this. How does spraying more fuel into a fire cool the metal down?
It relies on the physics of evaporation. Goddard engineered the injector head at the top of the combustion chamber to spray a very thin, deliberate film of excess liquid gasoline directly down the inside walls of the steel chamber.
Okay, so the walls are coated in liquid gasoline.
Right. Now, as the extreme heat of the main central fire hits that layer of liquid gasoline, the gasoline rapidly evaporates into a gas. And the phase change from liquid to gas absorbs a massive amount of thermal energy.
So the evaporation eats the heat.
Exactly. That evaporating gasoline creates a cool boundary layer, a literal curtain of gas, that insulates the steel wall from the 5,000-degree inferno raging just fractions of an inch away. It is an incredibly elegant thermodynamic solution, and curtain cooling is still used in modern rocket engines today.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here. Goddard is making these massive leaps: gyroscopes, thrust vectoring, turbopumps, curtain cooling. But he's doing it in absolute secrecy. He refuses to publish his findings. He refuses to collaborate with university engineering departments.
Right.
From a purely scientific perspective, wasn't hiding in the desert a terrible idea? The scientific method relies on peer review and collaboration. By locking himself away, wasn't he essentially starving himself of the academic manpower that could have accelerated his work?
It is the great paradox of his career.
Yeah.
Yes, from a macro-level view of technological progress, his secrecy was detrimental. Aerospace historians often point out that if he had openly shared his liquid fuel data with universities like Caltech or MIT, American rocketry as a whole would have progressed much faster.
Right. Because you have more brains on the problem.
But you have to look at it from Goddard's psychological perspective. He had tried being open, and he was humiliated by the New York Times. He had tried offering his tech to the military, and they shelved it. To him, the secrecy wasn't a hindrance. It was the only way he could protect his fragile physical and mental health long enough to get the work done. He simply didn't have the stamina to debate academics or reporters.
And the reality of his isolated testing in Roswell was that things failed constantly. Out of the 35 major rockets he launched there, many ended in catastrophic explosions, engine meltdowns, or crashes. His maximum achieved altitude was only about 1.7 miles or 9,000 feet. Weather balloons at the time were going much higher than that.
But Goddard emphatically rejected the idea that these crashes were failures. He wrote extensively about this to his financial backers. He explained that it is not a simple matter to differentiate an unsuccessful experiment from a successful one. He viewed every single crash as methodical, necessary data collection.
He wasn't just trying to shoot a dumb pipe full of explosives as high as possible to set a meaningless altitude record. He was trying to perfect the incredibly complex subsystems, the turbopumps, the gyroscopes, the gimbal mounts, so that when a rocket eventually did scale up to extreme altitudes, it would be a highly stable, controllable, reliable vehicle.
But unfortunately, while Goddard was patiently and quietly perfecting those subsystems in his self-imposed exile, the rest of the world was gearing up for the largest conflict in human history.
World War II.
Yes. And military intelligence agencies in Germany and the Soviet Union were taking copious, aggressive notes on his work, while his own government remained utterly, frustratingly blind.
The ignorance of the United States military brass during the 1930s is almost painful to read about. Goddard continually sent progress reports to the Army and Navy. The Weather Bureau expressed mild interest in using his rockets to gather atmospheric data, but Congress refused to allocate the funds.
And when military funding for rocketry was formally discussed, the head of the aeronautics department at MIT literally dismissed it, calling it the Buck Rogers job.
Buck Rogers being a popular science fiction comic strip, the implication was that Goddard's work was childish fantasy, entirely disconnected from the serious practical realities of military aviation.
But the foreign powers did not think it was fantasy. They saw the devastating potential of a long-range ballistic missile.
Let's talk about the espionage, because it is staggering how easily his secrecy was breached.
It really is. The German military intelligence, the Abwehr, actively targeted Goddard. They sent a spy named Gustav Gellich to the United States. Gellich actually claimed to have visited Roswell and gathered information directly from observing the Eden Valley test site.
He sent detailed technical reports back to Germany that included specific information about Goddard's liquid oxygen and gasoline fuel mixtures, and critically detailed descriptions of the curtain cooling technique Goddard had invented to keep the engines from melting. And it wasn't just the Germans. The Soviet Union had effectively infiltrated the U.S. military apparatus. There was a Soviet spy planted inside the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. In 1935, this spy managed to steal a highly confidential report that Goddard had written specifically for the Navy.
A report which detailed his flight tests and explicitly suggested military applications for his liquid-fueled rockets. The Soviets considered the intelligence so valuable that they translated it immediately and sent it directly to their own rocketry pioneers.
So you have this incredibly bizarre geopolitical situation. The sworn enemies of the United States are treating Robert Goddard like the aerospace genius that he is, while his own military establishment treats him like a nuisance.
By the time World War II actually breaks out in Europe, the Guggenheim funding temporarily dries up, and Goddard desperately tries one last time to offer his services to the U.S. war effort. And finally, the Navy bites.
But they don't hire him to build long-range ballistic missiles. A Navy lieutenant named Charles Fisher convinces the Bureau of Aeronautics to bring Goddard on to build JATO units.
JATO, Jet-Assisted Takeoff.
Yes. The Navy was operating heavy PBY Catalina flying boats seaplanes. These planes struggled to take off from short stretches of water or rough seas because they were so heavy. The Navy wanted Goddard to strap small, short-burn rocket engines onto the wings of these seaplanes to give them a brief burst of extra thrust to get them airborne faster.
It is such a massive demotion of his intellectual talents. He is the man who solved orbital mechanics, and they want him to build a booster rocket for a seaplane. An aerospace engineer who worked with him later noted that forcing Goddard to build a JATO engine was like hitching an eagle to a plow.
Goddard knew it was a distraction from his life's work. Furthermore, the Navy demanded that he relocate from Roswell to the Naval Engineering Experiment Station in Annapolis, Maryland.
Which was a terrible idea for his health.
Right. Goddard's wife, Esther, strongly objected. She knew that the thick, humid, sea-level air of Annapolis would absolutely ravage his tuberculosis-damaged lungs. But Goddard was a fierce patriot. When Esther begged him not to go, he simply replied, "Esther, don't you know there's a war on?"
So he packs up and moves to Maryland. And the tragedy of the Annapolis years is just profound.
I want to frame it this way. Imagine inventing the foundational technology for the smartphone entirely on your own. But instead of letting you build the iPhone, your boss forces you to use your brilliant technology to build a slightly better telegraph machine.
And while you are suffering in a basement building that telegraph machine, your rival across the ocean uses your stolen blueprints to build the actual iPhone.
Because that is exactly what happened. While Goddard is coughing in the Maryland humidity, brilliantly designing a variable thrust JATO engine that can idle, throttle up, and restart mid-flight, which was a masterpiece of engineering, but a tactical side quest, the Nazis are building the V-2.
The devastating realization of this comes in the spring of 1945. The Allies are pushing deep into Germany, and the U.S. Army captures intact German V-2 ballistic missiles. These are the massive, terrifying terror weapons that Hitler had been raining down on London from the edge of space. The Army ships one of these captured V-2s back to the Naval Laboratory in Annapolis.
And Goddard gets the opportunity to physically inspect this highly advanced enemy weapon. You have to wonder what was going through his head as he pulled the metal paneling off the V-2 and looked at the engine compartment.
It had to be a moment of absolute heartbreak and grim vindication. As he dissected the mechanics, he realized the Germans had essentially industrialized his life's work. He found 3 massive, specific technological pillars that he had personally invented, patented, and tested in Roswell.
Number 1, the turbopumps. The massive V-2 engine didn't use heavy pressurized gas tanks. It used highly complex, high-speed turbine pumps to ram the liquid oxygen and alcohol into the combustion chamber.
Number 2, the guidance system. The V-2 didn't rely on fins alone. It had a gyroscope connected to graphite steering vanes sitting directly in the rocket's exhaust stream, physically deflecting the thrust to keep the missile upright during the slow initial launch phase.
And number 3, the cooling. The V-2 combustion chamber didn't melt because the Germans were pumping a thin film of excess alcohol around the inside walls of the chamber. Evaporative curtain cooling.
Goddard was immediately convinced that the Germans had stolen his work. Now, to be historically rigorous, it is important to note that the German rocket program, led by Wernher von Braun, had access to massive state funding, brutal slave labor, and years of continuous flight testing. They also drew heavily from the theoretical work of Hermann Oberth. They didn't just photocopy Goddard's patents and build a missile.
Right, but the foundational practical engineering, the physical solutions to the bottlenecks, came directly from Goddard's published patents and the espionage. And we know this for a fact because Wernher von Braun admitted it decades later.
Yes, in 1963, Von Braun was explicitly asked about Goddard's influence, and von Braun, who by then was the chief architect of America's Saturn V moon rocket, stated plainly, I'll quote him, "Goddard's experiments in liquid fuel saved us years of work and enabled us to perfect the V2 years before it would have been possible."
It is a staggering historical irony. The man mocked by the American press provided the blueprint for the weapon that terrified the world. But Goddard didn't live to see the end of that story. The humid climate of Annapolis, the relentless stress of the wartime JATO work, and the heartbreak of the V2 broke his fragile health completely. In early 1945, he was diagnosed with aggressive throat cancer.
He continued to work in the naval lab as long as his body allowed, even when the cancer ravaged his vocal cords, and he could only communicate in a faint whisper. But it was too much. Robert H. Goddard died on August 10, 1945, in Baltimore, Maryland, at the age of 62.
He dies in August 1945, right at the very dawn of the atomic age, just days after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and right at the absolute starting line of the space age that he had engineered.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most crucial chapter of his legacy, because Goddard's story does not end with his death. And the reason it doesn't end is entirely due to the incredible, relentless work of his wife, Esther Goddard.
Esther Christine Kisk. Without her, Robert Goddard might have remained an obscure footnote, a tragic what-if in the history of science.
She was vastly more than a supportive spouse. She was his true intellectual and operational partner. When they were isolated out in Roswell, she didn't just sit around playing bridge with the local ranchers. She was the official photographer and videographer of the Eden Valley test site.
She operated the cameras during the launches, capturing the vital visual evidence of guided liquid rocket flight. She managed the accounting. She sewed the parachutes for the recovery systems.
And critically, after his death, she took on the monumental, agonizing task of organizing his entire life's work. Remember, Goddard was paranoid. He kept his notes highly disorganized and secretive to protect them.
Esther spent years painstakingly sorting through mountains of his diaries, test logs, and rough sketches. She translated his shorthand into formal patent applications. Through sheer force of will, she successfully secured 131 posthumous patents on his work.
Combined with the patents he had filed during his life, that brought his total to 214 patents. She built an ironclad legal fortress around his legacy.
And she used that fortress. In 1951, the Goddard estate, led by Esther, alongside the Guggenheim Foundation, formally sued the United States government for patent infringement.
They looked at the rapidly expanding military missile programs and the early designs of NASA, and they essentially said, "You are using Robert's gyroscopes, his turbopumps, and his thrust vectoring without permission and without compensation."
It was a bold legal maneuver, but her documentation was flawless. The legal battle dragged on for almost a decade. But finally, in 1960, the U.S. military and the newly formed NASA capitulated. They settled the suit for $1 million.
$1 million in 1960. At the time, it was the largest government patent settlement ever paid in American history. Half the money went to Esther, and the other half went to the Guggenheim Foundation to fund further aerospace research.
That $1 million was substantially more money than Goddard had received in funding over his entire lifetime of grueling research.
The vindication was absolute. The U.S. government formally recognized his primacy in the field. In 1959, NASA established the massive Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. And the actual hardware he developed, specifically the highly complex, throttleable, variable thrust engine he built for those Navy seaplanes in Annapolis, was directly adapted by Curtiss Wright to power the Bell X-2 rocket plane, which pushed human beings past Mach 3 in the 1950s.
But looking back at the entire arc of his life, it leaves us with this profound, lingering tension. I want to challenge the listener to think about intellectual property versus human progress. Was Goddard his own worst enemy? On one hand, his intense secrecy protected him from the devastating ridicule of the New York Times, and it protected his fragile health by keeping away the exhausting demands of the academic world. But on the other hand, did that paranoia cost America the early lead in the space race?
It is the ultimate counterfactual debate in aerospace history. Brilliant minds like Theodore von Karman at Caltech were deeply frustrated by Goddard's secrecy. They argued that if he had just shared his liquid fuel data openly with American universities in the 1930s, the collective engineering power of the United States would have progressed rocketry much faster before the war. Von Karman pointed out that total secrecy can trap you in an intellectual echo chamber, leading you down wrong developmental paths without you ever realizing it, because you have no peer review.
But I have to push back on that. Given how completely and utterly dismissive the U.S. military and academia were of spaceflight, literally calling his life's work a Buck Rogers job, Would they have even listened if he had opened his doors? If he had published his blueprints in 1935, would the U.S. Army have funded him? Or would his ideas just have been stolen faster and more efficiently by the Abwehr and the Soviets? I think it's a miracle he achieved what he did. The man was coughing up blood in a desert, funding his own revolution while being laughed at on the front page of the biggest newspaper in the world.
It is a stunning testament to the power of a single, unyielding vision. He operated almost entirely on intrinsic motivation, supported by a tiny, loyal circle of believers like Lindbergh, the Guggenheims, and most importantly, Esther. He didn't need the world to validate his math. He just needed the rockets to fly.
So let's briefly recap the arc of this incredible life. We started with a frail, sickly teenager sitting in a cherry tree in 1899, looking out over a meadow and dreaming of a mechanical device ascending to Mars. We watched him endure the horrors of tuberculosis, fighting the nurses just to get his calculus down on paper. We saw him face the humiliating moon man mockery of the global press, a ridicule so deep it forced him to hide his genius. We saw him retreat to the high deserts of New Mexico to build the foundation of modern rocketry turbopumps, gimbal steering, curtain cooling in absolute secret, only to have his design stolen by a regime halfway across the world to build the V2. And finally, we saw him posthumously vindicated, recognized as the undisputed father of American rocketry whose patents literally paved the way for NASA.
It is a story of incredible resilience, and it forces us to reconsider how our society treats the visionaries among us who sound just a little bit crazy at first. The line between a crackpot and a genius is often just a matter of waiting for the engineering to catch up to the math.
Which brings me to one final powerful image I want to leave you with. On July 16, 1969, a massive Saturn V rocket thundered off the pad at Cape Kennedy, carrying Apollo 11 toward the moon. Remember that tiny correction in the New York Times? The one admitting a rocket could fly in a vacuum? It was printed the very next day. But aboard that Apollo spacecraft, heading into the vacuum of space, was astronaut Buzz Aldrin. Buzz's father had actually been a physics student under Robert Goddard back at Clark University. And when Buzz Aldrin traveled to the moon, he carried a miniature biography of Robert H. Goddard with him in his personal preference kit.
It's a beautiful closing of the circle. The mocked moon man, who's told by the smartest people in the room that his rockets wouldn't fly in a vacuum, did, in spirit, eventually make it to the lunar surface.
I want you to reflect on your own impossible ideas. We all have that thing we are told is too ambitious, too weird, or just plain fundamentally unsound by the experts around us. What is your 41-foot cabbage patch launch? What is the messy, loud, barely functioning prototype of your biggest dream that everyone else thinks is a failure? And more importantly, who are you letting tell you that your ideas won't fly in a vacuum? Keep building, keep pushing. See you on the next deep dive.